today we are going to have a very short introduction to cryptography, more at a basic level rather than going a bit more into the technical side of it. So this is the agenda that we plan to cover throughout the next hour probably. Like we start with basically what basically is cryptography, and when we talk about security, there's something which always comes up called the CIA triad. We just see a bit more in depth into that. And authentication and authorization, these are two confusing terms which come across also when we talk about security. Then we start going a bit more into the cryptography part, where we see what is encryption, decryption, a bit more into symmetric, asymmetric, and all of it, hashing, MAC, and we'll go through this. And throughout the whole process, wherever possible, we'll also try to look at some real life scenarios where we would have encountered them as well, like all these cryptographic terminologies. So that being said, let me... Okay, so if you can look at this, this looks like something which is way too complicated to crack at this point. That it looks like some really complicated code that it would require a lot of effort to crack or understand if you want to send this across and get it hacked. But honestly, as we go on and see, this is probably one of the easiest things that we would end up cracking, that also we would do at a later point in this very session as well. But probably just to look at it looks a bit overwhelming at this time, but we will see that these were some of the most ancient cryptographic methods which were used to create codes like this. So talking about cryptography, why cryptography is actually important. If you have seen off late, there have been a lot of data security breaches or security related breaches that we come across. The problem is they might have some securities in place, but unless the security is very well implemented, you have a good knowledge about the base of security and how or where it's being used, it really doesn't help. Like if you have a very wealthy, you have a house which is filled with riches and all of it, but finally you don't have adequate security outside. You just have a locked gate, which you have, but don't have walls around it. That really doesn't make much sense to protect your assets. So the whole idea is that you should start from base rather than seeing security as an afterthought or something that you can integrate. Security is something which you should consider right from the beginning of a life cycle. So that is basically the idea behind this analogy. That, and for all of that, cryptography is basically the building block that we consider. So talking about cryptography, what exactly is cryptography? Cryptography is actually a Greek terminology which basically tells secret sharing or something like that. And there are two terms here also. One was called cryptography and another one is called the cryptanalysis. So cryptanalysis is the art of breaking the cryptography, and cryptography is basically when we are trying to secure any kind of data when you're communicating across the network or anywhere in presence of any adversarial behavior. So that is in short of what is cryptography. And before we go in depth into probably the modern cryptographic standards, so these were some of the historical cryptographic standards. Like probably you would have also seen some movies, like if you see something like Imitation Game or something, you would have seen some things about cryptography where I think Alan Turing tried to break the Enigma, things like that. So those are all comparatively older standards in cryptography which were being used. And this is how the cryptography basically started. That when it started, the techniques looked very, very simple, which could be easily broken by brute force attacks or just by probably understanding the logic behind the algorithm or something. You could easily break into those cryptographic mechanisms. So some of them were like the Playfair cipher, Hill cipher, Caesar cipher, Shift cipher, or Vignere cipher. So just to see some examples of how older cryptographic standards were working, assuming I wanted to send a message act to somebody, and I could use a key, something like this, which is called, basically key is something that you use to encode your message when you want to send something to cryptography. And once you encode through the key, through a particular algorithm, the output that you get is going to be called a ciphertext. So here what this Hill cipher, the oldest form of cipher, was actually doing was just basically converting it into numbers. The message that I want to encrypt is 0219 ACT as 02 and 19, and the key is getting converted into its equivalent decimal values, and you're just doing a matrix multiplication here. And the value that you get, we are just doing a mod of 26 here. The output that you get is finally POH when you convert this. So these are all very early forms of cryptographic mechanisms that we had. Another one was called Linear cipher, where for any message that you have, you choose a standard key and just repeat the key for the length of the message. Then basically you add these, like for example, G plus A, if you see the number mod 26. So this was one of the, you can just use something like a chart like this, where you can see for G and A, what is the letter that you would get. So that would be the output. So something like this is what you get as your cipher text when you try to add them and take a mod 26. This was one of the other method. This is basically where you are taking the key, taking the message and taking a mod of it. Another one is shifting, where for any message that you have, you can just shift it by a particular number of bits, basically like A, when you shift by 4 times becomes E. So something like this. This was another older kind of cryptographic mechanism which was being used in the past. But there are a lot of problems with all of these. These can be easily broken, as I told you, that it wouldn't take, for modern cryptographic standards, it wouldn't take less than, it would take less than probably a second probably to break all of these cryptographic standards. For example, in our current day scenarios, you can have the frequencies of letters, basically like in general, what is the frequency of a letter A appearing in a sentence, a letter T appearing in a sentence. So with that being our base, we can try to see here which are the most frequently used alphabets, and based on the frequency calculator, you can try to even substitute them to a particular letter and get your message back. Apart from that, if you go on the online, you do find a lot of online calculators which can actually help you break them. For example, I will. Yeah, so this is the Caesar cipher that I was talking about. Any message that I want, I can just go on to hello, and I can tell how many letters do I want to shift. And then this would be my output, something like this. So again, the same cipher text that I showed you previously, the one which was in the beginning of the chat, I can go back and decipher this as well. This would be my message. And when I just start running this, I can just see at which point do I get, okay, yeah. So this is what I had done, that it was just shifted by 1 bit. Although it looked like a very complicated thing, I could just find out what the message was in less than a couple of seconds, probably, if I really tried using a program or something. So like I told, with the modern technology that we have, these older cryptographic mechanisms that we have become more and more redundant, actually. So that is where we start going a bit towards our modern cryptography. Okay. So yeah, to start off with on modern cryptography, yeah, as I mentioned, cryptography is basically a science or art of securing the data in presence of adversarial behavior. That is, in presence of any kind of malicious intent or any kind of malicious users would be present. And modern cryptography, it is kind of divided into symmetric and asymmetric cryptography. Asymmetric is also called as public key. And in security, like I mentioned, there is something called the CIA triad, which you would look in the very next slide. So basically, cryptography is what would be used to implement the CIA triad. And some of the major concepts that we come across in cryptography include encryption, signature generation, verification. You might have come across a lot of these. We would look at them in a bit more detail, considering some real life scenarios as well. So yeah, what is a CIA triad? CIA is basically standing for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. When we talk about confidentiality, it is trying to ensure that the message that you send is only accessed by the intended recipient. So no one else should ideally be able to see your message, even if they encounter it in the middle somewhere. So yeah, in order to establish that kind of confidentiality, you want the identification and authentication of user to be agreed upon. Basically, you should be able to identify the user. And if you can see in your websites or in any of it, like when you want to go and make a payment, you might come across something like this is a secure 128-bit SSL payment, or some messages like this on on any of your platforms, whenever you're trying to securely, like you're trying to do a net banking or something like that, you come across such messages. So what is happening there is that your message, which you're trying to basically send to somebody else, which is basically sensitive, is getting encrypted before it is being sent over the network. So even if somebody in the internet or somewhere in the outer world is trying to read your message, they would just be able to see some kind of a gibberish content there. They would not be able to actually read your message. So what is the mechanism to implement confidentiality is encryption and decryption. Basically, encryption is on the sender's side. Whoever wants to protect the message would go ahead for the encryption. And on the other side, you would have the recipient who would decrypt that ciphertext, that gibberish that we come across, into a more meaningful message. And in the industry today, you will come across a lot of encryption standards and a lot of encryption algorithms. Symmetric is what is the most famously used and most common encryption which we come across. And among the symmetric also, AES is a one which is the industry standard right now. So AES encryption is the AES encryption and decryption is the most commonly used encryption standard for confidentiality. Again, we would get into this in a bit more detail as we go on. That was about confidentiality. Try and protect your message. That being said, there are also scenarios where you want that no one, okay, one thing is that, yeah, someone shouldn't read your message, but it is also possible that when I am trying to send a message, someone might interrupt. Although they are not able to read the message, they might spoil or they might mess up the message so that the other person is not able to read as well. It's true that the hacker or the attacker doesn't read the message, but the message that I intended to send the person gets changed in the middle. Like, for example, I'm just trying to send, I'm reaching the place and it can get changed to I'm not coming today if you don't have some encryption standard present or if you don't have any kind of integrity check. So what basically integrity check does is it prevents any kind of modification of unauthorized data, or rather than preventing, it lets the user on the other side, on the recipient side, knows if at all any kind of modification on the data has happened. And there are some very well known or very industry standard while techniques to confirm the integrity. They include hashing, MAC calculation, and signature verification. Again, we will get into this in a bit more detail, but to get our heads around this on where we would come across this, I can go with a very small example as well. Whenever you download any software, you might have come across the possibility of, okay, let me first probably do this. I'll do this for download. It should take a minute while this happens. Yeah, so I'm just trying to download something called VirtualBox, which is a virtualizer software. So whenever you download something on the internet like this, it's also possible that along with this, they give you something called the checksums. What this does is they calculate a checksum of this binary when they are sending it at at the sender side. And when I receive it, I can calculate the same at my end, basically. So if you see here for different, depending on which one I'm downloading, they've given me the hash values for it. So at my receiver end, when I've downloaded this, I can go ahead and calculate the hash of this, or I can calculate the integrity of this basically to try and check if it is the same as what they've provided here. In case there's a man in the middle attack where somebody else wants to add some malware or something into this, they can actually modify the package and send it to me. And once I calculate the hash of this, if at all the hash doesn't match what they've provided here, that does mean that the binary has been compromised. So that would basically mean that I should not be using this because it's been altered by somebody in the middle. So let me just quickly do this. So cert util hash file. So whenever I download a binary, if it's possible to verify the integrity, it's always a good idea to first check the integrity of that. Box and SHA-256. Okay, so if you can see here, the SHA-256 hash of this particular binary, which is here, is 1D something onto CDF. So this is something which is provided by the person who's uploaded it. And what I can do is I can go back and check this, if this matches what the VirtualBox had provided. So if you can see here, this is the one which I have downloaded. This is the binary which I had downloaded. And for that, I was able to calculate a particular hash, and that matches what was provided by the vendor basically when they had uploaded. So that basically indicates that nothing was tampered with when this was shared across, or when this was transferred from the server onto my system. So this is basically the integrity that I was trying to tell, that in the middle, you should try and make sure that no one breaches the binary or the communication basically. And yeah, so that was about confidentiality, integrity. And talking about the third part, which is availability, this basically indicates that for any authorized user, you should be having access to the services that you normally have at all times, irrespective of what the scenario is. So a lot of times you would have seen, for example, very recently as well, we did see that the Instagram, Facebook, all of them were down for some time. We were seeing some errors like error 500 something, which kind of indicates that the server is not available, or you're having trouble accessing the site. So the availability principle of the CIA triad basically tells that at all points, you should always have access to the information, provided you're an authorized user. So this another example is you would have seen, like, on, if you can think of our IRCTC servers or something like that. So at some point, we do see that we are not able to access it due to the load that is there. Like, for example, there'll be many people, like if you're students, like you would have come across this, that on the day of your results, for a very short time, you'll not be able to access because the server is jam-packed. So those are all called availability issues. Ideally, as a part of security, one, yeah, it is possible that it is a genuine set of users who are trying to access it. But apart from that, it can also be a preemptive attack, which is done basically on the server. So, like, for example, there's something called a denial of service, or distributed denial of service, where if I want to attack a service or a server, I can just try to ping the server from a lot of bots together to try and make sure that that server is not legitimately available for the authorized users who want to use it. So this is the availability part of the CIA triad. And the security principle kind of directly tells that you should try and make sure that you should always have access to the services that you opt for, provided you're an authorized user. Yeah, talking about authorization and authentication. These are two things that are also commonly used in security, and they're kind of used interchangeably, but there is a significant difference between both of these. So just to see what the difference is, authentication is basically to identify the individual. So when I'm trying to log into any server, like for example, I'm trying to log into LinkedIn or Facebook or something, I authenticate myself by having a user ID and a password. What that does is it's trying to see, okay, is this the person who he says he is? Whereas authorization is, although the server knows that I am who I am, it is not sure whether I do have access to something. So for example, you would have come across this, that on any of your shared drives or something, you're supposed to give accesses to people if they want to make use of your resources. So although you might be authenticated, access should be explicitly granted. So that is why you're telling that they're authorized. So authentication is to identify the individual, and authorization is basically when, after identifying the individual, what permissions the individual has in order to access the service. So that is about authentication and authorization. Okay, probably time for a very short break from our topics. Just this is more of a trivia kind of a question. We do all log into many of our different servers like LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, or things like that. And we do always enter our password. Do you actually know how the passwords are getting stored finally in the website? Do they, one could be that they're storing your plain text. One could be that they are storing the plain text as it is in some databases? Or do you think, like we spoke about, there's this confidentiality clause where they try to encrypt and store the passwords in your databases? Or do you think there is something else which is being done in general, like for any servers or anything that we do? How do you think our passwords get stored, if at all you have some idea about this? If you do know the answer, please do feel free to just write it out in the chat. We will try to see this also in the end, probably at the end of the session, on what the answer would be for this. And talking about this CIA, before we dive deep into the principles, like or the implementation of each of these, just some real life scenarios. When would you actually need confidentiality? When would you need integrity? And when would you need availability, or things like that? Just some real life scenarios would be, if you're a student or you're an employee, your manager or your lecturer wants to send you something like probably an appraisal letter or your results card. So at that point, they would have to ensure that that is something that only you need to read. So that is when you would look for confidentiality. So more than integrity, the most important thing that you would need then is the confidentiality. Not be able to read it. That is when they would kind of go for confidentiality. Again, for integrity, yeah, obviously it would be an add-on to also have integrity for the first use case, but more than that, there are other scenarios where you would also want integrity to be there. For example, the same your manager or your lecturer wants to tell you something about tomorrow, that tomorrow you have an exam or tomorrow you don't have an exam. More than that being confidential, you basically want to make sure that it is he who's sent it and he or she who sent it, and no one has modified it. For example, it could be possible that there could be a man in the middle who probably doesn't like this news. So they could just change the news in the middle. So in such scenarios, they should try to make sure that whenever they're sending you a mail or something, they can encrypt the mail for confidentiality and sign the mail for integrity checks. So again, if you have come across this, people who use Outlook extensively, Outlook does provide you that option that you can actually encrypt your mails, as well as you can add a signature. By adding a signature, internals we would again see at a later point, but what adding a signature is doing is it will try and validate you as a user, that you yourself have sent this message and it has been signed by you, and that it is not modified in the transit. Whereas encryption kind of makes sure that anything that you sent is only being read by the intended recipient. So these are some real life use cases where you would come across integrity and confidentiality. Like, of course, yeah, so that was a bit on more or less the introduction to the CIA and some real life use cases where you would come across that. Now we would start probably going a bit more into the encryption. We'll start going a bit more into the fundamentals part. What is encryption? Encryption is basically scrambling of messages such that any person who reads it in the middle, basically an unauthorized person, doesn't have access to it. So how can we do that? Like we already saw in some of the ancient things, you can use a simple key and just probably scramble it by 3 bytes, three characters or 4 characters, or you can just shift the characters one after the other, just to make sure that the middle person doesn't know. But like I told, in the current scenario, those are some things which are way too simple to break, especially with the kind of technology that we have today. So in order to do that, we have come up with something called the asymmetric and symmetric kind of encryption. What symmetric encryption does is, if two people want to communicate, both of them have a same common shared key in their possession. So someone who wants to send the message will call a particular encryption algorithm, pass their key as an input, pass their message as an input. That would give some kind of a gibberish message as an output that can be sent across the network openly. And anyone who reads it also won't be able to access it, because to finally decipher that message, you need access to the secret key. And on the other end, someone who's trying to read it, they need to pass the same key as the input, and that would decrypt and give you back the message as the output. And one of the most important thing about symmetric encryption here is that the key should be held secret on both the sides. If the key gets compromised, then this whole system fails. The algorithms that we use more often are public, and like I told you, there are a lot of very famous standard algorithms earlier ones, probably till 10, 15 years back, used to be called the DES. And now we have something called the AES, which is the standard for any kind of encryptions. Again, there are different modes and different key sizes, which we really don't have to worry about right now. But basically, this is the standard that is used for the symmetric encryption. Even now, when I'm trying to communicate here on Zoom as well, I did have this example just which I wanted to share with you guys as well. Now with this done, I can probably use this. There were, if you do remember, probably a year back or two, there was this talk about Zoom calls not being very secure due to the presence of the key being elsewhere. So earlier what used to happen, earlier what used to be happening is this secret key that we saw here, this secret key was basically placed at Zoom servers, which means during the start of any meeting, the key would be transferred to the host and to all the participants. But there was this concern that this could create a backdoor for anybody who uses it. So now that is what Zoom has also improved. Zoom has moved more or less to an end-to-end encryption mechanism. That is since probably the last year or so. So if I can show here, they use TLS, which is something of a standard which we use. And apart from that, here, as I showed, they are using an AES encryption mode to encrypt the data. So anything that I'm talking right now, whatever we are trying to communicate right now, this is getting encrypted over the network, and at each of your systems, it's getting decrypted. And now, after all the backlash over the Zoom keys being available at the server, now Zoom has shifted more towards an end-to-end encryption. So this is something I think we are also seeing in WhatsApp nowadays. What this basically means is the keys for these are getting generated at my end, the host's end, and also at the other people's end. So basically, even Zoom or anyone who owns this software or service will not be able to access this conversation right now. So that is how it is evolving, that we started from encryption. Firstly, the old encryptions where you just used to shift or just substitute. Then we moved to encryption where the key used to be held in a common server place. So now we are at a stage where we have end-to-end encryption, where anything that I talk, even the person in the middle, like that's what you see those messages from WhatsApp always says, that even WhatsApp doesn't read it. Earlier, that was also the case, that WhatsApp had the access to the keys, but now they've moved it to end-to-end, wherein the key is generated at the sender's end and it is only accessible at the receiver's end. So only we both will be able to access the data here. So that is a bit about symmetric encryption. And yeah, the whole secret or the whole challenge here is to keep the key secret here. That's where the security of the symmetric encryption lies. So in order to implement this, for example, even in any of our things right now, like when I have a request to Google or something, the data still gets encrypted and sent. You create something called a session, and in that creates an end-to-end channel, basically, where the data is encrypted throughout. Probably, yeah, we will try to cover that if possible at a later point, but that's the basic of encryption. And asymmetric encryption is where you have two keys present. So in this kind of scenario, both the communicating parties will try to create something called a public-private key pair. Public, yeah, as the name suggests, can be spread or can be distributed to all the parties involved in the communication, whereas the private should be held by themselves. So that being said, I would have access to probably all of the public keys which are available, and I'll have only access to my own private key. So when I want to send a message to somebody and that should be encrypted, I have access to their public key. I can just call the encryption algorithm, pass that person's public key, and I would get some kind of a ciphertext, which is basically gibberish, which no one understands. That can be sent across the network. The only key to decrypt that would be the private key of the person, which only that person would have access to. So that being said, you can, since I have access to your public keys, I will take your public key, I'll encrypt something, I'll send it out in the network. It can be read by anybody also. It's just that no one can finally understand it. And when it comes to your end, you would finally be decrypting it. Again, although we are not directly doing this, in pretty much everything that we do make use of most of these. Like when I send a request, the first time we are trying to establish a session with maybe Google or any kind of network, that is the first thing that we actually do, that we share our public key. We do have the public key of the other side. We first authenticate each other. We verify each other's credential. Then we create some kind of a symmetric key, which is used for the session. That is what we use for communication. Talking about asymmetric, there are different algorithms also which are available for this. Again, on the industry standards, RSA is what is being used more often than not now for asymmetric encryption. The next advanced standard is ECC. ECC is based on elliptic curve, and RSA is based on prime numbers. RSA is very much secure, but the time that gets invested in encryption or decryption is a huge time considerably. That's because your key sizes are of the order of 2048 bits, which is 256 bytes, which is kind of a bit long. ECC currently can provide the same security at a very smaller key size at 224 bits, which is very, very small. So like I told, the industry still kind of uses RSA right now, but we are slowly shifting towards ECC. That would kind of be the final goal for us. That being said, normally symmetric encryptions are faster compared to asymmetric because mainly of their key size as well and their robustness in which they can be done. So asymmetric encryption, even if it's being used, that would be used only at a very initial stage for us to probably communicate with each other, identify each other, and then create a common session key, which we both can use to communicate. Until that, we normally use asymmetric encryption. And once that connection is established, we can, there are different ways to do this. We can generate a common session key, or it can be generated at one end and also be sent across to the other end using the same channel that we have created. So asymmetric encryption is available, but more often than not, it's only for the initial stages. Then symmetric is what gets used. Okay. Kaushik?
So Abhishek, thank you so much for have shared some of the most interesting concepts in cryptography. Just going to take a break, guys, from Abhishek. I'm just going to quickly run you guys through a couple of things about AntWak's cybersecurity program I've shared in the link. So basically, the link that you click on will take you to this specific page, which talks to us about our cybersecurity programs. We are already running our 5th batch right now. And we currently have tie-ups with these companies, as we also offer placement systems as well. To just give you a brief about certain things that are covered. So these are the range of topics that are covered, which is introduction to cyber, network security, cyber attacks, forensics, incident management, SIEM, quite a few topics that are being dealt with. And if you want to have like a detailed version on the look of how what's going to cover on a granular level, you can always download the brochure. And once you register using the link in the chat, you can get further details from our academic counselors. We're currently going to start a 6th batch very soon, and it's pretty much going on, and that's the end that you get a certificate from us. We are very flexible in terms of payments. You also need to be aware that the experts that we come up with are cybersecurity professionals who've been in the industry for almost about 10 to 12 years, with over 15 years of experience with some of them. Our payment option is very friendly and straightforward. We give you 2 options. One of them, which is being sold at a very high price, is either you pay the entire fee upfront, or we give you an option called pay after placement, wherein you make a payment of 39,999, and then after that you get a job. We get 15% of your CPC deducted after you get the job. So we are very flexible towards the payment part of things. You can check out our curriculum, and we are sort of trying to wrap up a lot of batches right now. Is the right time to go and check out the link, and the sales people and the academic counselors would be more than happy to give you a brief about what the course is all about. That's about it from my end. Abhishek, you can take it forward from there. Thank you.
Sure, I'll show my. Okay, so we are back. We did look into the confidentiality part where we saw a bit about the different encryption standards which are available and what is being used in the industry. Then we also did talk about hash, where we also saw a bit about the virtual box and that software download and the integrity check. So what basically hashing does is, for every unique input that you have, you would have a unique key. It's more like a key value pair, where for every key that you have, you should normally have a unique value that is generated. So there are different standards. This is more like a one-way function which we have here, where using a particular message, you can get the value for that or the hash for that. But once you have the hash, you normally will not be able to get a message back from the hash. So where hash is being used is basically for the integrity checks. Like if at all I am trying to send you a message, one, I encrypt it to make sure that only you can read it, the intended recipient can read it. But like I told, it is possible that someone else might actually alter the message. How do I ensure that the message also reaches as it is, apart from not getting read in the middle? I can employ any of these integrity check mechanisms, one of it being hashing, where I call one of these hashing algorithms, one which we saw an example also, and I get an output as a message. So along with the encrypted message that I have, I can also provide the hash value of the message. That at the receiver's end, first you can try to decrypt, first you can try to verify whether the hash is the same, where you can calculate the hash of the same message. If the hash looks to be the same, then you can go ahead and decrypt it. That would kind of let you know that during the transmission or storage, the data was not modified by an unauthorized user. And talking about algorithms, again, just like how we talked about the encryption algorithm, hashing has also grown a lot. We used to have very simple CRCs, which just take 8-bit CRCs, where for so many different messages, there could be possible of collisions because there are just 8 bits. So at some point, the CRC, the cyclic redundancy check would finally start repeating. Then we also have different ones like MD5, SHA-1, and all of these. These were comparatively a bit older techniques. Slowly, they are also starting to have a lot of collisions. Like for two different inputs, you end up somehow having the same output. But again, the industry standard now is relying on SHA-256, where 256 is the number of bits. So 32 byte output is what you get. And that kind of tells you that you would have a unique output for every single input. So that being said, I can also go back to some SHA generation. Yeah, I do have some hash generation. So if you can see here, I will try to send a message. Right. You have all of these SHA generators. As you can see here, the message was something like this. So just changing from small letter to capital letter would end up changing the whole hash as well. It's not just that a small bit of the output changes. This is if I'm using SHA-1, okay, no, I think this is what we are using, SHA-5, 256 here. This is a 32-bit, 32 byte output. But in general, that is the advantage of SHA, that for although the inputs might seem very similar, even for a very small change in the output, a very small change in the input, the output completely changes. So there are, like I told, there are again different kinds of hashing mechanisms. The industry standard that we use right now is SHA-256. Currently, we do not see a lot of collisions here. That's why we are still using this. But if there's a need, basically we already do have some advanced standards as well, which can be used, which are already also starting to be used in different techniques, basically. So this is where we normally use hashing. SHA basically means secure hashing algorithm, and this is a family of different kinds of algorithms. And in SHA-1, you have 160-bit output, 224-bit output. There are like different hashing outputs that you get. And yeah, coming back to one of our trivia that we had, we did kind of talk about how the passwords are being stored. So normally, no website or web server tries to encrypt your message. What actually happens there is they finally don't need your message by plain text or anything like that. So what they do is, like I told you, since hashing finally has one output for one input at all points, and no two inputs give rise to one output. Whenever I can just try that with also an example. So I can So when I enter a password here, finally this password doesn't get stored. This password doesn't get stored anywhere on the internet. What happens is, the moment I give agree and join or something, this password gets converted to its hash. The hash value finally gets stored in the database. And every subsequent time that I try to log in, they calculate the hash of the password which I enter. They compare it against the hash that is stored in the database. That way, they're making sure that at some point, even if their database gets compromised, my password directly doesn't get compromised. All I need to do is just change my password. But finally, I don't have to really worry about someone getting to know my password, because normally my password never gets stored. That is probably the reason that when you actually give a forgot password at some point, you won't actually see your password back. They help you reset the password. The reason for this is they themselves don't have your password. What they would do is, again, when you give a new password during your reset password, they calculate the hash of this. They add some other things to it, but the main idea is that they calculate the hash for this password which you type, and then they store it into the database. If some website, when you give forgot password, is actually giving you back your original password, that definitely means that they do not have the right security implemented. That is something that you have to think about when using that website the next time. So yeah, that is about hashing. Another thing that we use for integrity check is MAC. MAC basically means message authentication code. This also is a kind of an integrity check finally. What this is compared to the earlier one which we saw, which is hashing, is here you do have a key concept. And why do we need a key concept? Because hash was also perfectly working fine, is that it could be possible that the other example that we saw, maybe it's being VirtualBox or something. If you're trying to send the hash of the message along with the message itself, whoever manipulates the message might end up changing the hash as well. But you would not know that because you don't have any way to verify. So in order to try and make this integrity a bit more secure, if you can also have a common key or something like that, which can help identify that apart from the message being decrypted by the right person, it also can, if it can try and help you understand that, okay, the MAC or the integrity was also calculated by the same person, that would help a long way in the security. And that is kind of what MAC does. In MAC, what happens is it is kind of very similar to what we saw in hashing, that for any message that you have you pass it through a MAC algorithm. Rather than directly getting a MAC as an output, you also pass a key along with this as an input. So the key adds some kind of identification, which you can do authentication kind of a scenario, wherein apart from adding the MAC value, which kind of tells you that the message is not compromised, you also have some kind of identification thing here, which gets added. So the MAC which gets calculated along with your message or your encrypted message, you can send it to your receiver. And on the receiver side, they would first try to use the same key. Basically, if you're using MAC, you have cipher-based MAC where both of you have to have the same kind of key. So it's a symmetric key that both of you will have a same symmetric key at both the ends. They would also use the same key and first try to verify the MAC of the message. If that MAC if that MAC matches with the MAC that you have sent, only then they can go ahead and maybe decrypt the message or try to identify that, okay, it has come from you. So apart from the integrity, this also adds an authenticity check. That is the advantage that MAC brings compared to hash. That being said, another advantage is that slowly over time, now another thing that is happening with hashes, again, like we know that anything on the internet is probably there forever. People have started to make use of this and try to make sure that whenever I try to calculate the hash for something, maybe I just tell calculate hash. It gives me a hash, something similar to what I just saw previously. And these hash strings and the messages are also getting stored at some servers. And at some point, they're also trying to create a reverse lookup table. So that is kind of bad in a case where you don't have a key and you're solely dependent on hash. So although it is still a bit secure at this point, slowly this is something which is developing up. So that is the reason we are slowly also shifting to MAC wherever possible, at least where the security is of utmost concern. That you don't want someone to actually read a message back from a hash. So that's the reason MAC would be a little more secure. And like I mentioned, yeah, it is used for integrity and authenticity check. And MAC is not used for confidentiality. MAC is normally used in addition to your confidentiality, like you encrypt it and also calculate the MAC. and send both the encrypted message as well as the MAC of that value. That's the use case of MAC. And MAC is basically used whenever you want to, okay, apart from just making sure that it's not just that there could be a man in the middle, it's also possible that some data could be corrupted during storage or something. So that also happens, that whenever you're retrieving data after storing or things like that from a storage, that time also it's always good to have a MAC stored elsewhere, where you know that, okay, this is the MAC of the message. If the MAC looks to be altered, that does mean that, okay, the data is corrupted or something like that. So these are some different use cases of where MAC is used. Again, there are two kinds of MAC which are present. One is the CMAC, which is cipher-based MAC, where, like I mentioned, you have a common key and it's being used. Another one is hash-based MAC, kind of similar to what we did see previously, but it is just based on the MAC principle here. That is about MAC. Again, the thing about MAC here is that the key that is being used on both the sides should be a symmetric key, which kind of makes it mandatory that it should be held secret, that no one should have access to your key, which could be a bit difficult in all the scenarios. That is where our next thing comes in, whereas it's the signature generation or verification. It is kind of similar to MAC. It is also used for integrity, and it also helps us verify the authenticity, but this is done using a public key cryptography. Again, if you remember, we did go across public key cryptography in asymmetric encryption and decryption. In this asymmetric encryption and decryption, if you remember, we did have our private key to ourselves and the public key to everybody else. So anybody who wants to send a message to me used to encrypt using the public, and I used to decrypt the message back using the private key. On the signature generation and verification side, it is slightly a bit different, because we have access to just our own private key. And whenever I send a message to you, I just have my private key and your public key. So rather than, okay, I can encrypt the message using your public key, but for the integrity check, what I would do is I would pass my own private key and pass it through a signing algorithm. And that along with the message, I would get something called a signature. So the message and the signature gets transferred to the other end. The recipient will have my public key. So passing my public key to a verification algorithm along with the signature and the message will try to decrypt. It's not exactly decrypt, but it will try to decode this signature. It will try to again calculate the signature for this. It will verify whether these both match. If they both match, then it tells you that, okay, it was signed by Alice. Assuming somebody in the middle, a man in the middle, either changes the message or the signature, even if they end up changing the message, they will not have access to changing the signature here, because this was calculated using a private key, which only Alice had access to. That way, when you get the message back, when you try to recalculate or when you try to verify, you can easily find out that, okay, when you calculate the signature for this and you try to come back to the verification scenario, the signature that you have calculated and the one which you got won't match basically. That way you would easily know that, okay, it was altered during the transmission. And as with MAC, this is basically to ensure integrity and authenticity, and it is not used for confidentiality. For confidentiality, again, you will have to finally depend on encryption algorithm. It could be, again, another asymmetric or asymmetric, but signature generation or MAC or any of these integrity checks do not provide security in terms of confidentiality. They just do the integrity check. And across the standards, again, the one which is most frequently used is the RSA standard. RSA 2048, RSA 4096 are some of the common ones which are used. Again, like I mentioned, this does mean that the size of the key is 2048 bits. That makes signature generation verification slightly a bit longer. Newer ones which are based on the elliptic curve principles are coming up, where the key sizes are way too less. Like for getting the same security as what an RSA 2048 provides, the key size for ECC can be of just 224 or 256 bits compared to 2000 bits. So that also kind of makes the operation also a bit faster. So these are some of the commonly used signing and verification algorithms. And real life examples where you would come across signature generation and verification is, you probably whenever you get a job offer or any kind of thing, you would normally be required to sign the document. That probably in the post-pandemic era, since we are not really doing a lot of physical signatures and things like that, people do ask you for a digital signature where you can sign your own document. So those are some use cases where you can make use of signature generation and verification. And let me see if I can go to one of the examples here. Yeah, another thing where pretty much most of the concepts that we have worked on are used is whenever you try to communicate with any kind of website or something, you would have seen HTTP versus HTTPS. S kind of implies that it has some inherent security already present there. And when I go inside and I start checking out what is that security, I'll be able to see that these mechanisms that we spoke about are finally being used here. So just to show you what that is. Where are these? Connection secure, more information. So these are some concepts of certificates. I think that would be a bit too much to cover in today's scenario, but once I go inside view certificate, you can see some of the things that we spoke about. They are something that's used. So this is for signing and verification. They're making use of RSA 2048. And for hashing, they're making use of SHA 256. And if at all they do come across any kind of encryption, they will make use of AES. I think that's something which is not present here, but that is kind of the real life use cases of where you can do this. And apart from that, yeah, see, this is what I was just trying to tell. So whenever you try to log into a certificate, if you have a good browser, it would kind of help you identify that, okay, they do have some security risks, like either it could be expired certificate or the algorithm which they use is probably outdated or things like that. So these are things that you can actually consider with a little more seriousness, which would probably help keep your data secure on the internet. And this is something that we saw. And yeah, these are just some online. I can just share the links also at some future point. If you want to play around with any of those old time ciphers that we spoke about or anything, you always have access to these. And this is kind of the one which I was also trying to tell, to get a message back from its hash. So this is the hash that was calculated for high. And when I go back, I can actually provide this. Like I told, there are a lot of engines like this which are present, which can take a hash and get a message back from that, if it is stored on the internet, basically. So it's trying to decrypt the message. Let me see if it's already stored on the internet. So if it's a very common thing that you're trying to calculate an integrity for, it is most likely possible that it is already available on the internet. So see, if you can see for the engine, I did provide the message of the hash as the input, and I was able to actually get the message back, which is ideally not a good sign. So this is probably why I told you that we are slowly moving away from hashing to a bit more secure, like something like a signature generation verification, or towards MAC based principles. And we did touch upon these. So yeah, these are some of the older kinds of ciphers which are being used from the older times. I think majorly that was it from the cryptography point, but this is just another nice trivia which I thought we could just have a look into. So have you come across something called steganography, where this is kind of somewhere similar to cryptography, but it's not exactly using the same principles, but it is on a similar level, that rather than worrying too much about the plain text cipher text, steganography finally is kind of telling you that you can hide something in the plain sight, something that no one easily can identify. So for example, it looks like these both are finally the same picture. They are pretty much the same picture, but in one of these a message is hidden. Like I can just try to show what that is. So the first one is the picture on the left there, and the second one is the picture on the right. I can always try to open these on notepads also. This is one, and this is my second one. So although the two pictures did look similar, I will try to. So pretty much, although the picture finally was the same, here you can see that I have actually added another message into the picture. Although in plain sight, they both do look the same. the second picture actually has something additionally that I can use. So this kind of technique of hiding a message within another message or hiding it in plain sight is basically what is known as steganography. So yeah, that was just a small trivia that I thought I'll also share once we are talking a bit more about the security side. With that, I think we can call it a wrap to the presentation side of cryptography. It would probably be time for some question and answers actually. You guys.
And Abhishek, that was a brilliant session around cryptography, because cryptography being a very sort of like a very theoretical based topic. Um, Yep. Making it interesting with these activities has actually kind of helped a lot. I think, Abhishek, we have a student, Asif, participant Asif, who just wants you to just speak a bit more about steganography. Just in a
Sure.
second, that's okay.
Sure, yeah.
Before Abhishek goes on, thank you so much for attending today's session. Whoever have attended today's session, registered, will receive the certificates to your respective email addresses. And on the other hand, you'll also be getting the recording, which will be available on the AntWak portal in the next 3 to 4 days. Abhishek,
Yeah.
he just wants, I think, a basic about steganography in brief. That's what.
Sure. Asif, like I mentioned, this is just one example. Steganography directly is not anything about, it's not directly related to cryptography, but it's just the art of hiding something that you want to do in a plain sight or within another message or anything. It could be just a picture within another picture or a message within another picture, like I showed you. Or wait, let me just share my screen again. It could be anything, like the implementation could be dependent on how creative you can get. This was just one thing that I could think of. So I can do something like, okay, this is one thing, like I showed, I can have something within the message, or if people are really intelligent and clever or things like that, I can just write a hello, something like this, where I can just have probably the first letters or the capitalized letters or things like that. So those are like the different ways in which it's just the art of basically concealing a secret within a plain view. Basically, like I can hide whatever I want to hide within a plain sight into a bigger message, which could be a picture, which could be a music, which could be a text or anything like that. So it's just the art of how you can conceal it within another thing. That's a whole different branch. Basically, it's not directly related, since it's just dealing with also the secretively writing something. I just brought that up. Does that give some idea, Asif?
Yep, he says thanks a lot. All right, guys, I have about 26 feedback that I've received. I still have about 50% of people on your screen. You just need to share your experience and your feedback so that we can try to make the next session a bit better. So if you guys can quickly kind of, cast your vote, that would be great. I already have about 50% of them who've already done it. Probably in the next 10-15 seconds, the rest of you guys can also participate. That would be great. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you so much, guys. Once again, Abhishek, it's a pleasure having you on board, and we look for more collaborations in the future. Guys, understand one thing: cryptography is one of the most essential topics in today's day, and it's always gonna be essential for you to understand encryption if you need to know what cryptography is all about. And I think Abhishek has made these things look a bit more simpler and easier to consume. Yes, Asif, there will be much more sessions, so keep checking our website. We also have another few sessions coming up next week around ransomwares, and we also have about networking concepts. So please stay in touch with our events page, and also we have a dedicated page on LinkedIn. But apart from that, I would request all of you guys to just come together and thank Abhishek for today's session. Abhishek, it's wonderful to have you on AntWak's platform, and I can't wait to have more sessions around a similar topic in the future.
Yeah, thank you, Kaushik. Just before I wind up, I think there was another message also. I mean, there was another question about how you can compile text into an image. Basically, all images you can actually edit it as a text also, and you can just open with any kind of text editor, and you can finally see the binary parts of it. And at the end of it or middle of it, anywhere you want, you can actually start putting in your messages also. Just try to open any picture that you want with a text editor. You will be able to see a lot which you can do around that. That was one thing. And like Kaushik rightly put it, cryptography is kind of the base whenever you want to enter into the security career. And this would more or less be like an atom into your big journey that you get into in security. So having a strong basics in cryptography would really help you go a long way to probably achieve greater heights. So that being said, thank you so much for being a part of this session. It was really a pleasure interacting with you.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you, Abhishek. You guys take care. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Have a nice weekend, guys.